What if the love of your life, the person you were about to marry, turned out to be a master manipulator, plunging you into a nightmare that began with a frantic 3 a.m. call from a Miami nightclub? Just 3 months ago, my world felt solid, predictable. My Midwestern home, the quiet hum of the AC unit, the comforting smell of my dinner leftovers. It was my sanctuary, a place I built brick by brick. Little did I know, a perfect storm of deceit was brewing, ready to shatter everything I thought I knew about my future. My name is Ethan, and I work in HVAC. It's a good, honest living, pulling in a respectable mid-60s a year. Enough to live comfortably, stash some cash for a house, maybe even snag a decent vacation once a year. Nothing flashy, just stable. My fiancée, Olivia, worked in marketing. She made about 40 grand, which is fine, totally respectable. But here's the kicker, she spent money like she was pulling in 6 figures. And I mean literally. Designer bags popping up every other month, bottomless brunches where a single mimosa cost $22, weekly manicures, the whole glossy Instagram influencer lifestyle. Except, she wasn't an influencer. She was just spending. When we first started dating 2 years ago, I honestly thought maybe her family had money. You know how some people are just born into wealth and don't make a big deal about it? But then I started noticing things that just didn't add up. She had this tight-knit group of 4 friends, Chloe, Emily, Sophie, and Ava. And all 4 of them? They were married to guys who actually made serious bank, investment banking, tech executive, commercial real estate. That level. Whenever we'd all hang out, I could feel this weird, unspoken pressure. It was like Olivia was constantly trying to keep pace with their high-flying lifestyle, even though her own financial situation was miles away from theirs. The red flags were everywhere, but the breaking point should have been when she started subtly criticizing the engagement ring I bought her. Not directly at first. Just these little, biting comments. Chloe's ring is 2 carats, or Emily's fiancé surprised her with an upgrade for their anniversary. And I'm sitting there, absolutely floored. I'd spent 4 months of my salary on that ring, and it was beautiful, handcrafted. But apparently, it wasn't enough. Her friends had set some impossible standard, and I was failing it. Then came the arguments about money. Oh, they weren't small disagreements. These were full-blown screaming matches. She'd accuse me of being cheap because I suggested we cook dinner at home instead of dropping $150 at some trendy downtown spot. Or because I didn't want to finance a brand new car when my paid-off truck ran perfectly fine. One night, after a particularly brutal argument where she called my lifestyle boring and said I had no ambition, something inside me snapped. I did some digging. Nothing crazy, just asked a few careful questions to some mutual acquaintances. And that's when the first real crack appeared in her carefully constructed facade. I found out her parents, specifically her dad, Mr. Harrison, had actually cut her off financially about 2 years ago, right around when we started dating. She'd been telling everyone, including me, this whole elaborate story about how they were still helping her out, supporting her lifestyle. The lie was so specific, so consistent, I'd never thought to question it. Not until things started falling apart. Looking back now, the chilling truth hit me. She'd probably seen me as a financial replacement for her parents from day one. So, here's where it gets truly messy. Olivia announced she wanted to do her bachelorette party in Miami. Okay, fine. Lots of people do destination bachelorette parties. Except her plan involved flying out her sister plus the 4 friends, staying at some luxury hotel in South Beach, bottle service at clubs, a yacht rental, the works. She estimated the whole thing would cost around $3,000 per person. I nearly choked when she told me this. We were supposed to be saving for a wedding and eventually a house. When I asked how she planned to pay for it, she got defensive. My friends are covering their own costs, she snapped, and my dad is paying for me and my sister. That should have been around $6,000 total. I told her that seemed like a lot to ask from her parents, especially since I'd heard through the grapevine that things were tight with them financially. That's when she exploded, screaming at me that I was trying to control her, ruin her special moment, accusing me of listening to gossip and not trusting her. Then, she packed a bag and went to stay with Chloe for 3 days. Completely ghosted me, except for a few ice-cold texts that made me feel like I was the bad guy. When she finally came back, she acted like nothing had happened. Casually mentioned everything was sorted. Her dad, she said, had agreed to cover all her Miami expenses, and I should just stop worrying about money so much because it made me seem insecure and, honestly, kind of pathetic. I wanted to believe her. I really did. At that point, we'd already sent out save the dates to 150 people, and I'd put a non-refundable $1,500 deposit on a venue. So I convinced myself, maybe I was being too controlling. Maybe her dad had come through. Maybe I just needed to let her have this one trip, and then we'd get back on track with our finances after the wedding. She flew out to Miami on a Thursday morning, and almost immediately, my Instagram feed exploded with her stories. And I'm talking luxury on a level that nothing her dad would have paid for could match. A suite at the Fontainebleau with an ocean view that probably ran $3,000 a night minimum. Bottles of champagne that cost more than my monthly truck payment. Designer shopping bags from Gucci and Louis Vuitton. Every single post was dripping with this performative wealth that made my stomach churn. Her friends were posting too, all of them tagging exclusive beach clubs like Nikki Beach and restaurants like Zuma, where the dress code probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. And I kept thinking, something doesn't add up here. This isn't what a dad paying for his daughter's bachelorette trip looks like. This is what someone drowning in credit card debt looks like. By Saturday night, I couldn't sleep. Just this gnawing feeling in my gut that everything was about to explode. I kept refreshing her Instagram stories, watching her and her friends pop bottles at some rooftop club overlooking the ocean. All I could think was, how much is this actually costing? And who's really paying for it? Because I knew damn well it wasn't her dad. I still didn't know that in less than 48 hours, I'd get a phone call that would completely destroy any future we might have had together. But looking back now, every single red flag was there, waving frantically in my face. I'd just been too invested, too afraid of starting over, to actually see them. Sunday rolls around, and I'm watching Olivia's Instagram stories at like 2 in the afternoon. They're at some beach club with cabanas that probably cost $1,000 just to reserve, bottles everywhere, her friends dancing on tables. The whole scene just screaming money that nobody in that group should have been spending, except maybe Chloe's husband, who's a VP at some investment firm. The thing that really got me was how calculated it all looked. Every single story was designed to show off maximum luxury. Designer sunglasses reflecting the Miami sun, champagne showers that were literally just wasting expensive bottles for the aesthetic. That weird influencer lifestyle that's supposed to look effortless, but actually costs a fortune to maintain. And I'm sitting on my couch in my 10-year-old joggers, thinking about how we were supposed to be saving for a wedding in 4 months, and how I'd been eating leftovers all week to cut costs. Then the story stopped, around midnight their time. I assumed they'd finally called it a night. I went to bed around 1:30 a.m., feeling uneasy, but telling myself I was probably overreacting. That maybe her dad really had been generous. That I should just trust my fiancé and stop being so paranoid about money. That this was her bachelorette party, and I needed to let her have fun. My phone started ringing at exactly 3:17 a.m. I knew before I even looked at the screen that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Because nobody calls at 3 in the morning with good news. Nobody. And when I saw Olivia's name, I almost didn't answer. But some instinct, maybe just years of trained responsibility, made me pick up. She was crying. Not like sad crying, but panicked, hyperventilating crying. The kind where someone can barely get words out and you can hear the terror in their voice. And through the chaos, I heard her say, "My card declined. Ethan, my card declined. And we're stuck at this club and they won't let us leave." I was barely awake, trying to process what she was telling me, my brain still foggy from sleep. Nothing she was saying made any sense. She explained, or tried to explain, between sobs and gasps, that they'd gone to this exclusive club in South Beach called LIV, the kind of place where you need to know someone or drop serious money just to get in. They'd ordered bottles of Grey Goose and Dom Perignon, and apparently, food from the VIP menu. They'd run up a tab of $8,000. Except when the bill came at closing time, every single card got declined. Hers, her sister's, even Emily's backup American Express. And the club manager was threatening to call the cops unless they paid at least $6,000 in cash right that second. Immediately. No negotiations, no payment plans. I asked her where Chloe and the other girls were because surely someone in that group had access to money or could call their husband for help. Olivia said they were all scrambling, trying to figure it out, calling banks, checking account balances. But they'd only managed to pull together $4,000 between all 5 of them. And she needed me to send $2,000 right this second through Zelle or Venmo or whatever would work fastest, because the club had taken all their IDs and driver's licenses, and they literally couldn't leave the building. There was a security guard standing right there, making sure nobody ran. That's when everything clicked into place for me. Like, suddenly, all those Instagram stories and designer bags and expensive dinners and that ring criticism made perfect, horrifying sense. And I realized her dad hadn't paid for anything. Not a single dollar. She'd been putting this entire trip on credit cards that were now completely maxed out. And she'd been lying to me for months, maybe years, about her actual financial situation. And I was supposed to be the bank that bailed her out. I sat there in my bed in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my fiancé beg me for $2,000 to get out of a Miami nightclub at 3 in the morning. And I felt this weird calm wash over me. Like the kind of clarity you get when you finally see something you've been avoiding for way too long. When the illusion just completely shatters. I said, "Call your dad." And she immediately started crying harder. "I can't, Ethan. I can't call him. You have to do this. You're my fiancé. You're supposed to help me. This is what partners do." I could hear her friends yelling in the background, and some man's voice with a thick accent, probably the manager, saying something about police and theft of services, and how this happens every weekend with girls like them. I told her one more time, very calmly. Probably the calmest I'd been in months. "Olivia, call your father. I'm not sending you money for this." And then I did something I'd never done before in our entire 2-year relationship. I hung up on her mid-sentence. And I turned off my phone completely. And I went back to sleep. And I'm not going to lie, I slept better that night than I had in months. Like some massive weight had been lifted. When I turned my phone back on around 7 a.m., I had 63 missed calls, probably 200 text messages, and a bunch of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. The messages ranged from Olivia begging and apologizing and promising she'd pay me back, to her friends calling me every name in the book. Telling me I was a terrible person, a coward, that I'd abandoned my fiancé in her darkest hour. What kind of man lets his future wife get arrested over money? You're financially abusive for not helping. That word, arrested, made my stomach drop. Because up until that moment, I'd kind of assumed they'd figured something out. Maybe called someone's parents or worked out a payment plan with the club. But apparently, things had escalated way beyond what I'd imagined while I was peacefully sleeping. Around 9:30, I got a call from a Miami-Dade Police Department number. When I answered, this very tired-sounding officer with a thick Florida accent explained that Olivia had been arrested around 5 a.m. for theft of services and disorderly conduct. Apparently, she'd gotten belligerent with the club staff when they wouldn't let her leave. They were holding her on a $1,000 bond. And the club was also pursuing an $8,000 civil claim for the unpaid tab, plus damages. The officer asked if I was planning to post bail. I said no, I wasn't. He sounded kind of surprised and asked if I was sure, because usually fiancés help out in situations like this. I told him I was very sure. And he just said, "Okay then," and hung up, like he dealt with 1,000 situations like this before and mine wasn't even that interesting to him. The next few hours were absolutely insane. Olivia's friends blowing up my phone with increasingly angry messages. Her sister leaving me voicemails, crying and begging me to help, saying I was destroying their family. Even Chloe's husband called me and tried to do this whole bro thing about how we need to take care of our women, and sometimes that means bailing them out of tough situations. And I'm thinking, dude, your wife helped create and enable this entire disaster. You don't get to lecture me about responsibility when Chloe was probably the one encouraging all the spending. Then, around 2 p.m., I got the call that changed everything. It was from Mr. Harrison, Olivia's dad. His voice was this mixture of exhausted and furious that I'll never forget. Like a man who'd been dealing with this same problem for years and was just completely done. He said, "Ethan, I need you to know something. We haven't given Olivia money in over 2 years. We cut her off completely because she had a serious spending problem. And when she told us about this Miami trip, we explicitly told her we wouldn't pay for it and she needed to cancel." I just sat there listening as he explained that Olivia had been hiding $40,000 in credit card debt from me. That she'd opened new cards in her name only that I didn't know about. That she'd been making minimum payments and juggling balances. And that after this Miami disaster, her total debt was probably over $60,000. And he was completely done bailing her out because they'd been doing it for years, and it never helped. He told me he was flying to Miami that night to deal with the legal situation, not because he wanted to help her, but because he didn't want her to have a criminal record that would completely destroy her life. And then he said something that really stuck with me. He said, "I love my daughter, but she needs to face consequences. And honestly, Ethan, you should think very carefully about whether you want to tie yourself to this, because this is who she is." And then he apologized to me. Actually apologized for not warning me sooner about her spending habits and her lies. And I realized that this man had been watching his daughter manipulate and lie to me for 2 years, and probably felt terrible about it, but didn't know how to intervene without causing a huge family blow-up. I sat in my apartment for the rest of that Sunday afternoon, blocked Olivia's friends on everything, ignored the calls from her sister, and started making a list of what I needed to do next. And the first item on that list was, call off the wedding. But I didn't know yet that the real drama was still ahead of me. Olivia got back to town Wednesday afternoon. I knew because Mr. Harrison texted me that he'd picked her up from the airport. She was an absolute mess, crying the entire flight back, barely speaking to him, except to blame everyone else for what happened. And he warned me that she'd probably try to come to the apartment to talk things out, and I should prepare myself. I'd spent those 3 days without her doing a lot of thinking. Like, really deep thinking about what kind of life I'd been signing up for. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about money or one bad decision in Miami. This was about fundamental values. About honesty. About trust. About the kind of partner someone is when things get difficult, and whether they take responsibility or blame everyone else. She called me around 6 p.m. that evening, and I could tell she'd been crying for hours. Her voice was raw and shaky, and she immediately launched into this whole prepared speech about how sorry she was, how she'd made a terrible mistake, how the trip got out of control, and the girls kept ordering more bottles, and she panicked when the cards declined. I let her talk for maybe 2 minutes before I cut her off. "Olivia," I said, "this wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern." And she got quiet in that way people do when they know you're absolutely right but don't want to admit it, because that would mean taking real responsibility. I told her about my conversation with her dad. About the $40,000 in hidden debt that I'd never known about. About the 2 years of systematic lying. About how she'd been cut off long before we started dating. And she tried to flip it on me, like I knew she would. Started saying I'd abandoned her in her darkest moment, that a real partner would have helped her instead of leaving her to get arrested, that I'd humiliated her in front of her friends, and now everyone knew we had problems. That's when I knew for sure that she didn't actually understand what she'd done wrong or why this was a deal breaker. She kept framing it like the problem was that I hadn't sent the money. Not that she'd lied about everything for 2 years. Not that she'd built an entire lifestyle on credit cards and deception and expected me to fund it. Just that I'd failed some kind of test by not bailing her out when she got caught. And I realized we were speaking completely different languages when it came to responsibility and trust and what a partnership actually means. I told her very clearly, and I remember these words exactly, this isn't about the $2,000 in Miami. This is about the $60,000 in total debt you hid from me. This is about lying to my face for months about your dad paying for things. This is about building a life together on a foundation of complete deception. And she started crying again, begging for another chance, saying she'd get help. She'd talk to a financial counselor. She'd cut up her credit cards. She'd do whatever it took. But I'd already made my decision, and nothing she said was going to change it. Because I'd finally seen her clearly. The next morning, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I'd prepared for this. I had a box of her stuff by the door, all her clothes and toiletries, and the random things she'd accumulated at my place over 2 years. When she saw that box sitting there, she just crumbled. Physically slid down the door frame onto the floor, crying, asking me how I could do this to her, how I could throw away everything we'd built, how I could give up on us over one mistake. I stood there, looking at this woman I'd almost married, and felt absolutely nothing except relief. Like I'd just dodged the biggest bullet of my entire life. And I told her something I'd been rehearsing. We didn't build anything, Liv. You built a fantasy, and you expected me to pay for it. And that was the last conversation we ever had as a couple. I handed her the box. She took it, still crying, and she left. And I closed the door and locked it and felt this massive weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 2 years. The aftermath was brutal in ways I didn't expect. Not for me, but for her. I heard about it through mutual friends who hadn't completely taken her side in the breakup. She'd lost her apartment within a month because she couldn't make rent without my contribution, which I found out later had been covering about 40% of her monthly expenses. She had to move back in with her parents, who basically put her on complete financial lockdown. Took away all her credit cards, gave her an allowance of $200 a week, made her account for every single dollar she spent, and monitored her bank account. She also lost her job. Apparently, she'd called in sick for 3 days after Miami without actually clearing it with her boss. And when she finally showed up on Thursday, her boss had already heard about the arrest through some industry connection, because Miami is a small world, and they let her go during her probation period. No explanation needed, completely legal. Her total debt ended up being around $70,000 once you factored in the club's civil suit, the legal fees from the arrest, the maxed-out credit cards, and some personal loans I hadn't even known about. Mr. Harrison hired a lawyer to negotiate payment plans and settlements, but made it very clear to Olivia that she would be paying back every single cent herself over the next decade. No more bailouts. No more enabling. This was her mess to fix. The friend group completely imploded in spectacular fashion. Chloe, Emily, Sophie, and Ava all basically ghosted Olivia once they realized she'd been lying about her financial situation and had made them all look bad. And apparently, there was a lot of blame being thrown around about who encouraged the Miami spending and who should have stopped things before they got out of control. The whole thing just dissolved into this toxic mess of former friends pointing fingers at each other and blocking each other on social media. Someone told me that Olivia tried to tell people I was the bad guy in all this. That I'd been financially controlling during our relationship and that's why she'd hidden the debt. That I'd isolated her from her friends and made her feel small. But most people who knew us both didn't buy it because they'd seen her spending habits firsthand and knew I lived pretty modestly and had never tried to control her. I packed up the engagement ring. It had been sitting in my nightstand for weeks, like this monument to a failed relationship. I returned it to the jeweler and got about 60% of what I'd paid back, which sucked, but also felt like closing a chapter. I used that money as part of a down payment on a house, a small 3-bedroom place about 20 minutes outside the city that I'd been looking at before all this happened. Moving into that house by myself was honestly one of the best moments of my life. No arguments about decorating or whether we could afford certain furniture. No pressure to buy stuff we didn't need just because her friends had it. Just me, setting up my space exactly how I wanted it. And I kept thinking about how different this would have been if I'd married Olivia. How every single decision would have been a fight. How every purchase would have come with judgment and comparisons to her friends and demands for more expensive versions. I ran into Mr. Harrison about 2 months after everything fell apart, completely by chance at a hardware store. We talked for a few minutes in the parking lot. He thanked me for not enabling his daughter. Said that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the real consequences of their choices instead of constantly cushioning their fall. He apologized again for not warning me sooner about her problems, but said he'd hoped she'd changed and didn't want to interfere in our relationship. He told me Olivia was working retail now at some mall store, making $12 an hour, living at home, going to therapy twice a week that he was paying for, and slowly paying down her debt at about $300 a month. And he hoped eventually she'd learn from this and become a better person. But he wasn't holding his breath, because she'd been like this since high school. I think about this whole situation sometimes, especially when I'm sitting in my house that I own by myself, mortgage in my name only, no one to answer to about how I spend my money or live my life. And I realized that phone call at 3:17 a.m. was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to see the truth I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Everyone wants to believe their relationship is different, that their partner would never lie to them about something serious, that love conquers all, including massive debt and fundamental dishonesty. But the reality is that how someone handles money and stress and truth-telling is exactly who they'll be in a marriage, except amplified by legal and financial ties you can't easily escape from. 3 months ago, I was planning a wedding to someone who could have destroyed my financial future, buried me in debt I didn't create, and gaslit me into thinking I was the problem for not wanting to enable her lifestyle. And today, I'm planning my actual future, looking at investment options, thinking about maybe getting a dog, living a life that's simple and honest and completely mine. Some people told me I was too harsh, that I should have given her another chance, that everyone makes mistakes and deserves forgiveness. But here's the thing, this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice she made over and over again for years. And the only thing she was sorry about was getting caught. Not about the lying or the debt or the manipulation. So, yeah, that's my story. That's how a 3 a.m. phone call from Miami saved me from the biggest mistake of my life. And honestly, I've never been more grateful to have said no to something. If you're watching this and seeing similar red flags in your own relationship, trust your gut, because it's probably right. Do you think I handled this situation correctly, or was I too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life narratives.